Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to have with me today Jeff White. And who is Jeff White? We'll find out very soon. But as you know, what I'm trying to promote is people have a better understanding of their civic engagement and responsibilities. And I can assist in that with the legal perspective and the political perspective. But where I need a lot more help is on the financial aspect and how these decisions that government makes affect us in our daily life. And so I have Jeff with me today, and with that, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Eva. So, Jeff White. I am a lawyer by background, like Eva, but in fact ended up spending most of my career in the capital markets, investment banking, and institutional sales and trading. For anybody that may be familiar with those fields, and as a result of my interest in finance, I've always had a keen interest in economics as well, and particularly as it relates to government policy and how that impacts all of us on a daily basis, really.
And that's what I'm really hoping to get into today because there's so often, I think there's a very big disconnect with government money. Number one, maybe let's start with what that means because I think we really need to highlight that that's a taxpayer's Canadian's money. The government doesn't create money, does it?
It does not, and in fact, it's an excellent point, Eva, and one that is an incredible fallacy out there. How often do you hear people say, "Oh, well, it's a the government subsidy or a government grant," and think that somehow that is costless in some way, shape, or form? But the reality is, every dollar that the government spends has to come from somewhere, and ultimately, the source of those funds is either taxes or ultimately inflation, right? There is the government is very much like anybody's household. You just cannot they cannot create money out of thin air. Every dollar they spend is coming from somewhere. Now, debt is an option for short-term funding, but ultimately that needs to be paid too. Again, either out of the proceeds of taxes or inflation. And so those are the sources. There are no others. And so it's important for people to understand that any government spending is coming out of our pockets one way or another.
So, is there any way you think that Canadians can start to appreciate that more? Like, if the books were open, do you think they would get it? Or I know this is kind of a difficult question, maybe to start with, but I think until Canadians appreciate that a bit more, it's hard to get them interested in the subject. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe more people are interested. What are your thoughts?
It's an interesting question. I mean, if you think back to maybe our parents or our grandparents' time, they very clearly understood the connection between government spending and taxation. It was they understood that fiscal prudence was important and critical, and they rewarded politicians for it at the ballot box at the end of the day. Right, so ongoing deficits and things like that were understood by the population, at least a generation ago, that it would ultimately come back to negatively impact the citizenry. Today, through a lot of obfuscation and what have you, we are kind of led down a path to believe that somehow these all of this spending will is costless again at the end of the day, right? That somehow the growth or what have you that all of this pay for itself. Right? We're making investments in the future when in fact that is really not the case. Most of these things are not investments in any way, shape, or form. And I think if people really understood the link between just this understanding that government spending needs to get paid for somehow, and the only sources are taxation and inflation, which, by the way, is really a form of taxation and a very serious form of taxation. I mean, inflation is absolutely devastating, particularly to the most vulnerable. It's a form of tax. So those are the only two things. So if people just get their head start from the point of every dollar spent has to come from somewhere. It's coming from you one way or another, taxation or inflation, or future generations are gonna bear the burden.
So,
Same thing for them.
quick question. What about fines and administrative fees? Those are, do you consider that under taxation then, or just because they're so much smaller that you don't really worry about those?
They they are included essentially. All regulatory fines, all of these fees that are associated with. I mean, I don't know anything. Establishing a business,
Yeah.
running a medical practice. All of those things are kind of a quasi form of taxation. Some of them, maybe quite justifiable at the end of the day, but it still is a cost that's coming out of somebody's pocket and going into government coffers. It's a quasi taxation, if you will. Again, some of those things may be more justifiable than others.
And like it's coming, if it's not coming from those administrative fees, it would come from somewhere else. And this is something I think a lot of people don't appreciate. When I opened a couple brick and mortar businesses, I just couldn't believe, and that's what a lot of people hear, the red tape. And I heard those words so much, and it didn't affect me, so I didn't really think about it too much. But the administrative hurdles that government puts in place, in addition to like all these fees that they have well before you even open your doors. And I actually said to a couple like bureaucrats that I was dealing with, do you want me to go out of business before I even start the business? And like zero comprehension of that. So I think that's an interesting point, because it would have come out if they didn't have these fines or these fees, they would have just been taxing more. So it's kind of like a little sly. This
Absolutely.
is our first conversation, and I really would like to have a few of these, like make it quite a bit regular, because I think this is something that, lots of people could use a lot of information about. You use the term inflation. Can we break that down for a regular Canadian?
Well, I mean, inflation for the average person is seen through the higher cost of living, essentially the higher cost of goods and services over time. And I mean, that's how inflation manifests itself. But really, inflation at its core is an increase in the money supply. Right? At the end of the day, it's monetary policy which drives inflation. People like to think of oh well, people get into a mode where they think just costs are going to go up year in and year out, as it's gravity. It's just kind of a natural course of things that always happens. It doesn't have to happen. It is a conscious decision by government to continually increase monetary policy, increase the money supply through monetary policy, and that gets particularly uh, problematic when you have to get paid for somehow. And increasingly we are turning to printing money, essentially, printing money, which is an inflationary phenomenon, in order to cover the cost of those deficits. So you think about it, as manifests itself in the higher cost of living, virtually everything, but really it's a money supply issue, and deficit spending uh, over time just exacerbates the issue. I don't know whether
So
that is helpful.
yeah, definitely. So how I'm interpreting it is that government creates money, and then because it's creating money, is that wrong already from the start? Or okay, that's okay.
No,
And it leads to increases in the costs, you said. But as taxpayers, as Canadians, we have to make up that difference, because there's more now, more money inside of the ecosystem. Is that right?
sure. Well, I mean, so it wouldn't be a problem really if it were the fact that real incomes kept up with inflation. If your paycheck went up 10% every single year and inflation happened to go up 10% every year, or the cost of living went up 10%, it's essentially a wash for you. You're not any worse off from a fundamental perspective. The problem is that that inflation tends to outpace real wage growth, and so that leaves Canadians further and further behind, or any Canadian or American or anybody who's facing this kind of issue, further and further behind over time, right? So the inflationary monetary policy uh, results in the higher cost of living, and unfortunately, in most cases, does not translate into higher real wages, and
Mhm.
that is really the nub of the problem. And there's reasons why the real wages can't keep up with inflation. I mean, that as well.
Can you give us some of the reasons why wages don't align with inflation?
Sure. Well, again, inflation is a monetary policy issue. It's a money supply issue. Wage inflation is driven by productivity growth. That's really the essence of it. And
Mhm.
I mean, I like to talk to people and try to break it down into very simple terms. If you're a farmer, as an example, your ability to go out and purchase other things, clothing, automobiles, what have you, your purchasing power is determined by the amount that you produce on the farm, right? That's your supply, your productivity is also the source of your demand. They're really two sides of the same coin, right? Supply and demand are really two sides of the same coin. So without increased productivity, you don't have an ability to then increase real income, right? Because the productivity isn't there, and that ties back a little bit to your earlier point, which is all of these regulations and hurdles to actually make an investment in business really suppress productivity growth, and again widen that gap over time.
Yeah. Okay, so actually making things more difficult, not less difficult for the
Very
regular Canadian.
yeah.
And sorry, did you want to add something?
Well, and particularly so for those most vulnerable, right? Those people that are living paycheck to paycheck at the end of the day are most impacted by these things. Inflation actually does benefit a certain subset of society. Anybody with assets, if you own a big securities portfolio, stock portfolio, if you own buildings or your own home or what have you, everybody benefits from inflation in that sense. The problem is that there's a whole swath of the population that doesn't own their own home, doesn't own a stock portfolio, and don't own any hard assets that see the increase from inflation. Right? So it's
Because
the most vulnerable.
those assets increase in value. That's why you're saying they benefit.
That's right. They benefit on that side of the coin. They benefit by
Got it.
virtue of the fact that the higher money supply. Well, just look at today, and the cost of housing is a great example. Housing costs or housing prices have gone up so dramatically, in large part. I mean, there's a number of contributing factors, but in large part to the inflationary pressures. Right? People start looking for assets, they're hard assets, but real assets to put their money in, because it's an inflation. It protects them against inflation. As the money supply grows and grows and grows, all of these assets become more and more and more expensive. So if I'm an owner of those assets, I do benefit on that side. Now I do also have the higher cost of living and all of that. I experience that too if I'm an asset owner. The problem is, again, for a lot of people, you don't get the benefit of the asset price inflation. You only see the cost pressures.
Okay, great. I think we might just stick on this topic a bit more. So let's bring it into real life too, and what we hear people saying. So, like, I hear Pierre Poilievre talking about inflation ad nauseum, which, given what you're saying, I could see why he's doing it because it really affects the day to day. We have Jagmeet Singh talking about the grocery prices and just going like narrow view on that. And then I'm not actually sure if I've heard much, if anything, from Trudeau and his government about it. So, can you just give me your thoughts about where these three federal leaders are coming from and what you see in terms of inflation coming from them?
I mean, from a policy perspective, I think your Pierre Poilievre is he does understand the concept. He really does. He understands these core economic concepts and is quite rightly drawing people's attention to inflation because, as I mentioned earlier, it is not just a law of nature. It's an actual direct result of government policy. So that it's been our government policies over the last number of years which has led to the inflation that we're experiencing today. Uh, there's certainly a reason why Justin Trudeau and the Liberals want to play that down, just for the exact reason that Pierre Poilievre wants to raise it, is because their policies over really. I mean, it's been going on for a long time, and it's not just a Liberal government issue, but it's been particularly acute in the Justin Trudeau regime, where these policies, including just profligate spending far in excess, deficit spending far in excess of receipts, is ultimately resulting in inflation. So they want to be relatively quiet about it.
Mm-hmm.
The conservatives want to draw attention to it, and I think the NDP focusing on by trying to focus on things like groceries, it's really an attempt to connect to the uh, their base, which is the working class person, presumably, who feel that more acutely. But I'm not sure that Jagmeet even understands the causes of inflation. He's just trying to address a symptom, and oftentimes, that's misguided. You hear in the paper about, oh, we need the grocery stores to charge less money for groceries, and we should legislate that in some way, shape, or form. I mean, that's a complete misunderstanding of the cause and effect of the inflation issue.
Incredibly helpful on inflation, I have to say. And I kind of had a general idea, but I think it's helpful to break it down like that. One thing I think that, and you mentioned it already, is the deficit and how that really plays in when there's a large deficit and an increase in inflation. So, can you help bring those two concepts together? Maybe just starting with where we're at with the deficit and how we got there.
Well, I mean, the numbers are sadly going up all the time, right? We are at really historic highs, or near historic highs, anyway. From a well, I think we are at historic highs from an annual deficit perspective, and as a debt issue, on a debt to GDP basis, we are certainly near, if not at, historic highs, into the 70s or so. Interesting enough to Pierre Elliott Trudeau's time to see these levels of debt to GDP, and so we're at historic highs. The deficits, in particular, as I say, need to get funded every year. Somehow you've got to make up the shortfall between how much you're spending and how much you're bringing in receipts from all sources. And so there's only two immediate sources of income, or well, is either central bank funding those deficits by essentially printing money, or debt funding, which is a short-term solution but adds to the fiscal burden every year. I mean, we talked today about $50 billion just to service the debt. right? So that's an ongoing burden, just going to put more pressure on future deficits. And again, that debt ultimately needs to get paid. And so that, and the sources, as we talked about, are either taxation or inflation. And so whether paying for it, or it's our children and grandchildren that are paying for it, but somebody is going to bear the brunt of all of this spending.
Well, and this is, I think, something I'd like to get into a bit deeper. Is you started, I think, with household. You kind of compared it to a household income, but there's only so much you can take on, and like I think your debt ends with you. I think generally, and how is it that we could go into? You've already talked about future generations that are going to be holding this debt. So how is that happening, and why are we letting it happen?
Well, I mean, to tie back to the household thing, you're exactly right in the sense that for the average person, for you and I, our ability to fund anything ultimately comes down to our ability to then to either get credit to pay if we're going to overspend in any one particular year, right? We're going to spend more than we earn. Well, we can get that debt financed. We can find a bank that will give us a line of credit or something along those lines to help us make up the shortfall. But eventually, and they will look at our future income potential and all of these things that will enable them to come up with a credit limit that they think is appropriate. But ultimately, if that gets too out of whack, the the lenders will cut us off, right? They will
Hmm.
say, no, no more, we're not going to let you borrow anymore. And on that path, until you get to that point, by the way, the cost of borrowing can go up and up and up. It starts with a, home equity line of credit or something, and then all of a sudden you're putting on a credit card debt, and the cost keeps going up and up as your credit worthiness goes down. The same thing is true with government. Over time, borrowing costs will continue to rise if the market, the capital markets, all the potential funders look at Canada and say it's a fiscal basket case and it's not getting any better. And yes, they have the ability to increase taxation as a potential source of future income, but we are already at very high levels of taxation in Canada relative to a lot of other nations. And so all of the things that impact you and I as households impact governments as well. It's just harder to see on such a grand scale. But I mean, at the end of the day, a country is just a collection of households, and you know they've only so many levers they can pull on to increase their income, or ultimately they have to rely on money printing, which is something that you and I can't do.
Yeah. I keep taking notes because I have thoughts and questions as we go. So you referred to it, I think you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, um, that in Canada it's a basket case, or is that what you meant right now fiscally? And I'm going to still ask you a bit more, and that taxes are higher because today I just saw the National Post come out with an article that said that Canada has lost $255 billion in foreign investment, I think it is. And so, again, correct me if I'm wrong with what you were intending to say, but do you think that's what the world sees right now is that Canada is a little bit something's up here, and they see that we are taxed very high, so there's not a good chance that you could continuously raise taxes on people.
Those are two slightly separate issues, but somewhat related in the sense that on the first hand, going back to the funding of the deficits and investors' willingness to continue to provide capital to lend to the country to deal with our near term deficit, absolutely that is impacted by the current fiscal situation. They're looking at it and they're saying, "Geez, is it likely?" I mean, even the Trudeau government basically has no plans, at least that I'm aware of, to reduce the deficit meaningfully between now and 2030. There's no balanced budget plan for the foreseeable future. And so that's something that as an investor, as a lender, you would look at and say, that's going to impact my willingness
Mhm.
to lend and the cost that I'm going to attribute to that. The foreign investment issue is, again, a separate but related issue. Part of the reason that foreign investment is not coming into the country is because they look at a whole host of factors, including the regulatory regime, not just taxation, but how easy is it to do business in this country? Going back
Mhm.
to your much earlier point about even starting a small business. So,
Mhm.
what kind of an investment climate, what kind of a business climate is there in Canada? And if it's not a favorable, welcoming investment environment, well, then I'll take my marbles to a different sandbox, and that's what they do. And unfortunately, that also impacts the productivity issue because investment is what grows productivity over time. It's critical to make capital investments. That makes everybody more productive over time. If those funds aren't coming in, if they're not being invested either by foreigners or by Canadians, then our productivity suffers. And then we go back to that same issue that we had at the beginning, which is inflation outpacing real income growth.
Incredibly helpful. Thank you. That was great.
A bit technical, but anyway.
Well, I think what you said is the budget doesn't balance itself.
It certainly does not for you and I, and not for a nation which is a collection of households. That's exactly right.
So, like I said, I want to keep this one a bit shorter today, and I want to digest and then do this again and more because I do think there's an appetite for this, and I think there's a lot of words people are throwing around, and we need to get a better understanding for it. But I think one thing you've mentioned a few times is how this is affecting future generations. So maybe if you could give a little bit more of your concerns about it and how you see that we could manage that in the near future or not.
Well, I mean, the larger the debt becomes, the harder it is to grow out from under it. Right. I
Mm.
mean, because economic growth can alleviate a lot of stresses. It reduces the burden on future generations. Economic growth, of course, generates then more revenue, more income sources for both government and Canadians, generally speaking. And so economic growth is really what leads to prosperity over time. And so, to the extent that we don't have a clear path towards economic growth, and you've seen over the last really 40 years, economic growth, which used to be GDP growth, used to be kind of in the 3 to 5% range, was kind of a very common growth rate for
GDP, what does it
GDP.
mean? What
Oh,
does it
sorry,
mean?
gross domestic product. Gross domestic product. Basically, it's a measure, and not a perfect measure, but it's a measure of economic activity in a country, right? So gross domestic product. How much is the country itself uh, generating in terms of
Producing.
economic
Yeah.
activity? Exactly. So that used to grow at 3 to 5%. Today, geez, 3% would be great economic growth. We're now in the 1 to 3% range, and
Really?
and trending down. So that, together with higher and higher debt levels being caused by larger and larger deficits, means digging yourself out from under is going to be much more difficult, and that's what is going to impact future generations, because at some point they're going to have no hope really of economic growth skating them back on side. And so then ultimately you resort to inflation, and then things can go off the rails very quickly, and it's a very sad situation for future generations if that in fact
So
materializes.
interesting. Sorry, there was a bit of a delay there, but incredibly interesting. And I thought this was obviously going to be interesting because I hear people saying, well, I don't have time, or time is always one, but money to learn something more or do something more because everything is so expensive. And my response back is, why are things so expensive? And I think you really appreciate it, and I hadn't thought about this until this conversation, is if we're not in a financially stable or good position and we see our GDP going down, we're not in a position to be talking about all these lofty goals and ideas and pleasures that the federal government want to get involved in with, reducing carbon and all of these things, if we can't even afford our own to sustain ourselves. Like, if you really look at it on a big picture, is that right?
Sure. I mean, and just to minor correction is GDP is not going down. The growth is growing. The growth rate is going down. So we're not
Got it.
shrinking,
Yeah.
and also of course immigration. To be really apples to apples about it, you'd want to be doing it on a per capita basis to try to figure that out. But regardless, it is the growth is slowing without question, and so. And sorry, I just the second part of your for your question was
Well, just
uh,
we're not going to be able to maintain, or we can't maintain
oh,
these
oh, yes, yes, yes,
ideas
yes, yes.
of making
Oh,
Canada better if we can't even sustain
oh,
ourselves
oh
on
my
a
gosh.
basic
Sure.
level.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry. Yes. So all of the promises that get tossed around out there by, I mean, it's not again just a liberal government thing. They happen to be in power today, but all politicians from all stripes are always out there talking about how we're going to spend money over here and spend money over here, and all these we're going to get all these fantastic benefits from it. Of course. There's a reason they do that. It's to try to pander to to certain groups and voters. But ultimately, there's two things. One is we can't afford it today. We're
Yeah.
already in an incredibly high deficit position. So adding more to that funding gap is only going to exacerbate the problem. And any government spending on any program is just diverting capital. Going back to the very beginning of the conversation, it's diverting resources away from normal Canadians that would be otherwise spending it differently, right? And so any government program, they like to frame them as investments. We're making an investment in the clean energy sector. We're making an investment in the you name it. It's ad nauseum, but they do that because it obfuscates the issue that all of those investments are actually just money coming out of your pocket one way or another, either today or tomorrow, one way or another, and going into something that you otherwise wouldn't be spending it on. And
Yeah.
then that's just critical for people to understand.
And maybe just, I think that's a similar concept really too to the rebate. They first take a big chunk of money and then they're like, oh, here's $100 back, which now is
Oh,
like 10 items at the grocery store. Not even.
well, I mean, you bring up a great point. That stuff drives me bananas. It's worse because to administer the program costs
Yeah.
a fortune, right?
Yeah.
So think about
Good
taking
point.
$100 from somebody's pocket, turning around and giving them back 40, right? To say, oh well, geez, you're net. You look at us, and of course, there's a separation between when the $100 comes out of your pocket and the $40 comes back in, right? So you're, oh geez, it feels like a win, but and meanwhile the cost of administering that is, I don't know what the number is.
$200.
It could very well be $200, absolutely, right? But it's just evaporated into government bureaucracy, and that makes all Canadians worse off, less prosperous. Everybody.
Yes. And wow, like so, so, so important. And this is why, like, I didn't appreciate even before today why Paul Huvier kept going on about inflation. And clearly, I think if we have a better understanding of how it affects everything, it's important. And like I said, I'd like to continue this conversation because I think Canadians, we have a lot of work to do here. Like there's a lot we can do having these conversation, asking these questions of our elected officials, but it helps if we're a little bit more conversed in the issue. So I hope this started a helpful dialogue on that. I'm just thinking of 100 more questions. So we'll bring you back, I hope. We're still going to do a few more minutes here on the Twitter or X paid subscribers and getting a few more details in, but thank you so much. Anything else that you want to add here at the end, or where can people find you? What are you doing outside of this podcast?
Well, I mean, I don't have a huge social media presence, unfortunately. I do have my regular employment. I run my own small business, but I am on LinkedIn. I run a small company called Hinge Markets, so you can find me there. And yeah, happy to come back and chat anytime about these topics or any others economic related. So
Wonderful.
thank you for
Let's do
having me.
that. Well, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So that one ended.